When Joe Biden made his announcement that he was going to nominate an African American female to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, Republicans responded with vicious and unfounded attacks, including claiming that the nominee, despite her credentials, would forever be known as the affirmative action nominee and ultimately justice. What does that even mean? And what is the current and likely future status of affirmative action in hiring and in college admissions? Experts weigh in. Coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
The term affirmative action is a hot button political issue, no doubt. And the term has recently gained prominence in the media as a result of Biden's commitment to appoint a Black woman to the Supreme Court. And because the Supreme Court agreed a couple of weeks ago to hear two cases that could change the role that affirmative action plays in college admissions. The Supreme Court will decide in its next term whether the use of race in admissions at Harvard University and University of North Carolina, violates the U.S. Constitution. The case will be the first test that affirmative action in college admissions has had since the court's tilt towards a 6-3 conservative majority. The court's most recent ruling on affirmative action came in 2016 in a case called Fisher v. University of Texas, where a 4-3 majority upheld the University of Texas race-conscious admissions program, ruling against a challenge to the policy brought by a white woman. Now, two of the key justices in the Fisher case are no longer on the bench. However, the three dissenting justices in that case are still there, and with the new three conservative members, 40 years of decisions on race and admissions designed to achieve diversity may fall prey to the agenda of Republicans and white supremacists who seek to erase the history of slavery and decades of Jim Crow policies that locked the brightest students of color out of colleges and universities across this country. Here for my leadoff discussion is Michaele Turnage Young. She's senior counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She represents a group of Harvard students who have filed an amicus brief in the lawsuit filed by Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard and the University of North Carolina. Good morning, Michaele, and welcome.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so much going on right now. People are trying to make sense of what's going on with this affirmative action. We keep hearing it. We are hearing it with respect to these nominees. Of course, Republicans are attacking the potential Supreme Court nominee, saying that her appointment is going to be an affirmative action appointment. And we're talking about affirmative action because the U.S. Supreme Court, agreed to take this case that involves a challenge to the admissions policies used by Harvard and the University of North Carolina. Now, I know that you and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund are involved in the actual lawsuit. So tell us what your role is with respect to the lawsuit.
Sure. So we have the honor of representing 26 Harvard student and alumni organizations as amici curiae, which essentially means friends of the court. These are organizations that have, some of them been in place at Harvard for more than 100 years. Some of them include alumni who have, who have graduated over the course of 7 different decades. They have a wealth of information that the court looked to in trying to make a reasoned decision about this case.
So tell us the status now. We know the Supreme Court's going to hear the case, a consolidated 2 cases in its next year's term. But how did it get here? How did it get from the lower courts to the Supreme Court?
Sure. So with regard to the Harvard case, this is a case that was filed by a group called Students for Fair Admissions back in 2014. You mentioned that a woman named Abigail Fisher was involved in the last case that made it to the Supreme Court. So she and her father and a man named Edward Blum actually helped form an organization called Students for Fair Admissions that is now the plaintiff in this case. So that case was filed in 2014. The district court held a trial back in 2018. That's the District of Massachusetts. Trial lasted for about 2 weeks. The court heard from a number of witnesses, heard all sorts of evidence, and made a lengthy, well-reasoned decision, finding that there was no discrimination and reaffirming that the consideration of race in admissions is extremely important. That case then went.
Michelle, let me ask you this. So the Students for Fair Admission, what were they claiming in the initial lawsuit that went to trial?
So they were claiming that the consideration of race as one of many factors in admissions was a violation of Title VI and the Equal Protection Clause, and was a form of intentional racial discrimination against Asian American applicants.
Okay, so that case went to trial in Massachusetts. The lower court heard 2 weeks of testimony, and ultimately the decision was in favor of Harvard, finding that its policies were not discriminatory as it relates to Asian students.
That's correct. That case then went to the First Circuit. The plaintiff appealed. The First Circuit affirmed the district's court ruling.
So the appellate court ruled with the trial court that there was no discrimination.
That's correct.
And so how did that case then get consolidated with the University of North Carolina case to get now to the docket of the Supreme Court? So
the plaintiffs appealed, or they filed a writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court. And while that was pending, the district court, actually, I'm not exactly sure about the timing, but the district court in the UNC case actually made another lengthy ruling finding that there was no discrimination. And the plaintiffs asked that that case be consolidated for consideration before the Supreme Court with the Harvard case. And that request was granted.
Were the plaintiffs in the UNC case the same group, Students for a Fair Admission?
Yes.
Now, how is it that this organization of Abigail, the Abigail Fisher, right? The white woman that had sued the University of Texas, who lost, and now she's teamed up, her and her dad, you said, with this guy named Edward Bloom, who's kind of an activist, obviously, let's call him what he is, a conservative activist. How did they have standing in either case, since Abigail obviously wasn't a student at Harvard or UNC? Did they recruit students from those respective schools to act as the lead plaintiffs?
So they, the Fishers serve as, if I'm not mistaken, officers in this organization, and this organization claims to be a membership organization, serving students who applied and were unsuccessful in gaining admissions to these schools. We don't have a ton of information about this organization, so can't really say too much more about that.
I want to bring into the conversation John Yang. He's the president and executive director of Advancing Justice. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
So, John, I was reading some of the statements that this guy, Edward Bloom, made when the Supreme Court agreed to take the case on, in its next docket. And he said this was a victory for Asian students. He said Asian students have been unfairly discriminated against at both Harvard and UNC. Do you agree with those statements?
I absolutely disagree with that statement. The incoming class of Harvard is about 25% Asian American, and Asian Americans represent about 7% of the American population. So just on those statistics alone, it doesn't make sense. But frankly, more than that is what Edward Bloom did after the Fisher case in the Supreme Court. He was very explicit saying, I need an Asian American plaintiff. His notion was that he wanted to find another minority group to use as a political wedge to make his case a little bit more sellable to the general public.
So he lost with a white woman and said, okay, let me go find me a model minority that I can use to challenge these affirmative action policies. Now, I know Michelle says she doesn't know much about this organization, but sounds like you know a little bit more about it, John. What's the motivation? I can imagine the Fishers are mad. They lost their case in Texas, but what's Bloom's rap? I read something that he had lost a congressional race to a Black person, and maybe he's just angry about race. Do you have any reason? Do you know more about why he's motivated to file these lawsuits?
I can't say that I do, but I agree with you that we know that he has a history of conservative activism, not only as it relates to pushing back against racial equity, but also in trying to suppress voters and trying to advocate for election laws that would disfavor people of color.
Michelle, tell us what these admission policies are, because I don't want to leave people with the impression that race plays a bigger role in the admission process than it does. So help us understand how race plays into the admissions process.
Sure. So race is just one of, I think somewhere around the neighborhood of like 100 factors that are considered when considering whether to admit a candidate to a given college. And of course, the admissions process depends on the university. So race, plays a very, very, very small role among, many other things in the college application. The college is considering things like an applicant's intended concentration. They're considering what geographic location the applicant's from. They're considering their personal statement, their recommendation letters. They're considering what courses they took. Many colleges have abandoned standardized test scores at this point because we know the research shows that standardized test scores underpredict the potential of Black and Latinx applicants, but colleges are considering a wealth of information about applicants. And an applicant's race might just be one tiny portion of what's being considered.
So Michelle, if John, those statistics he cited, Harvard's admissions, admitting a class that they admitted 25% Asian, Asians represent 7% of the population. So what possibly can be the argument that somehow Asians are being discriminated against in the admissions process when they're represented more than 2 times what they represent in the general population? I mean, it seems like Harvard has a very robust program of accepting Asian students.
So, the plans we represent are vehemently opposed to racial discrimination. The Legal Defense Fund is vehemently opposed to racial discrimination. The problem here is that we have a lawsuit that's essentially functioning as a Trojan horse, taking these very, real concerns about racial discrimination against Asian Americans in the United States, and taking them and trying to use and exploit that as a vehicle to advance this lawsuit that is intended to eliminate the consideration of race in college admissions nationwide, which of course we know would hinder colleges and universities' ability to consider how racial discrimination played a role in interfering with the educational opportunities of students at the pre-K through 12 level. We know that educational opportunities in this country, unfortunately, are not equal. And the consideration of race in admissions is one way that colleges and universities can try to mitigate for that.
John, is it safe to say that Asian Americans have benefited from affirmative action when you look at those numbers that you cited, the 25% Asian population at a school like Harvard?
Absolutely, Asian Americans have benefited from affirmative action. And part of this is we also need to what we would call disaggregate that data, because sometimes people think of Asian Americans as this monolith. I appreciate that you all talked about it in terms of this model minority myth. The reality is that Asian Americans represent so much more. And there's so many communities that are underrepresented, whether it's a Vietnamese community, Laotian, Hmong, et cetera. And so we need to break that down. And the reality is, look, we all benefit when we're allowed to talk about our race. We're allowed to talk about our culture. That's part of who we are as individuals. And this notion that we can't talk about it. And that's what really Ed Blum is trying to get at with this lawsuit. This notion that we cannot talk about our race is very deeply disconcerting and frankly racist in our minds.
So John, I was reading that this organization, Students for Fair Admissions, they claim they have 20,000 members and that they have thousands of members who are of Asian descent and their family members. So is there a countervailing argument that you are aware of in the Asian community? I recognize that you don't represent all of Asian people and that the Asian community, as you just said, is not a monolithic community. It has many components to it, but you have your ear to the ground and you are working with lots of other Asian groups. So what is the general consensus, if there is one, in the broader Asian community about college admissions and the use of race?
Thank you for asking that question, because there is also this myth out there that Asian Americans by and large oppose affirmative action or oppose the consideration of race. The reality is, in polling that we've done with other organizations, is that about 70% of Asian Americans support affirmative action. A Gallup poll indicated around the same percentages. So the reality is that Asian Americans support affirmative action, support the use of race. You're right, obviously within any community, there are some that believe a contrary thought. But let's be clear about where Asian Americans by and large stand.
So Michelle, do you have any insights as to why the court took this case up, particularly given the ruling in the Fisher case?
Well, I think, it's curious, right? Because this is a matter that the court has considered so many times over the past 43 years. So of course we have the Bakke decision in 1978, where the court says that it's legally permissible to consider race in college admissions. The court again revisits this in 2003 with the Gratz and Grutter decisions, and again reaffirms that it's legally permissible to consider race in college admissions. The court revisits it again with Fisher in 2013 and also in 2016, and says again in 2013 and 2016, it's legally permissible to consider race in college admissions. And now here we are in 2022 with the court visiting this again. It's curious. Usually you don't have the court weighing in on an issue like this repeatedly and saying again and again and again and again, it is legally permissible to consider race as one of many factors in college admissions. And yes, we very much value the educational benefits of diversity. And yes, this is important for equal opportunity. But here we have the court, taking it up. And I will say that, any ruling that would call into question the legality of the consideration of race as one of many factors in college admissions would be a sweeping reversal of 43 years of Supreme Court decisions telling us exactly the opposite, that in fact, it is legally permissible to consider race as one of many factors in college admissions.
What do you imagine, John, happens if the court does overturn its own decision, the body of decisions that Michelle just outlined for us, if it says, for some reason, today, this policy is unconstitutional, even though we've affirmed it for several decades? What do you imagine that means for admissions for particularly Asian students on college campuses?
Unfortunately, that means that we would go backwards in diversity. And we know what will happen because we've seen this happen, whether it's in California because of the propositions there, what happened at a certain point in Texas. And that will mean that we have a body of students that is less diverse, which means we don't have the same diversity of thought, the diversity of experiences. It's a different educational experience. One thing I want to make sure I make clear to everyone is, look, we all oppose discrimination. If we found that there was discrimination occurring at Harvard, we would be in line to sue them. But we found in that extensive fact finding, that 2-week trial that Michelle talked about, there was not discrimination against Asian Americans, let alone other groups. So that's where we should center ourselves is, look, we should root out real discrimination. This isn't it.
Michelle, in that 2-week trial, I'm glad you brought that up, John. You said in that trial, you were able to glean that there wasn't discrimination. What evidence did the plaintiffs put on in the trial to support their claim of discrimination?
Interestingly, not one witness from Students for Fair Admissions testified. We presented, several witnesses. So there were 4 students, alumni who testified, and we presented witnesses. They all testified about the importance of equal opportunity, the importance of diversity, the importance of considering race in college admissions. But Students for Fair Admissions didn't have one student witness or anyone else testify saying that, hey, I would have been admitted absent discrimination. More than that, they analyzed 480 admissions files, 2/3 of which they were able to cherry pick from that source. They also analyzed data from 160,000 applicants and were not able to find one scrap of evidence or one admissions file that they contended reflected an applicant who would have been admitted absent discrimination. It's
what was their case? Did they have some expert witness? You just talked about the analysis of these admissions files, but what did they put on?
So they did, in fact, have an expert witness. They had a couple of expert witnesses. Harvard, of course, had its own expert witness. And what you saw was essentially a battle of the experts. And in any case that involves experts and a battle of the experts, you might have experts that analyze the data in a different way. So SFFA's expert, for example, had 6 years of admissions data at his disposal. And for whatever reason, he chose to consider all 6 years of that data as though an applicant to the class of, let's say, 2015 were competing against an applicant from the class of 2019. As we know, when you apply to college, you compete against the applicants who are in that cycle. You're not competing against people who applied 4 years prior. In addition to that, the expert witness that SFFA put forward didn't consider a number of things that absolutely play into the decision. He didn't consider, for example, an applicant's preferred concentration. And these are things that absolutely matter. And so what you had happen was SFA's expert had his conclusions. Harvard's expert, did a similar econometric analysis and came up with his own conclusions. He kind of modeled the admissions process in a way that looks a lot more like the way it occurs. He didn't have applicants competing as though they were competing against people who had applied 4 years prior. And Harvard's expert didn't find any statistically significant indicia of discrimination. And the court found Harvard's expert's analysis to be more credible because it better approximated the actual admissions process.
John, do you feel like this lawsuit, because when people hear about it, I think the knee-jerk reaction might be that Asian students are in some ways attacking the admissions of Black students, of Latinx students. Have you had experiences where there was tension or potential for tension between Asians and African Americans and Latinx communities over these lawsuits?
Unfortunately, we have seen that. And I will be the first to admit, unfortunately, there is a degree of anti-Blackness that we have to contend with in the Asian American community. But the other thing I want to center ourselves in is that for many of these parents, they're just trying to look out for what's best for their kids. And unfortunately, they've bought into this storyline that Ed Blum and others have offered to them. And as Michelle was saying, the admissions process is so much more complex than just test scores and grade point averages. If we're going to have this conversation about admissions, we should be having this conversation also about how legacies play into this, how what are called the dean's list or president's list applicants are play into this. Because then we get a much different understanding and we don't focus in on this one very narrow factor called race, because Michelle is absolutely right, is that this is a narrow factor that is used. It's not as all encompassing as some of these opponents have made it out to be.
Do you know, John, how many colleges, universities across this country actually even still use race? Because some, I would imagine, don't use race as a factor at all.
Actually, I'm not aware of those statistics. Unfortunately, I am not.
So I'll ask you, Michelle, what's next for this lawsuit? It's going to be heard by the Supreme Court. What are you thinking? What's going to happen?
We're not sure exactly what's going to happen. I would not, kind of immediately jump to doomsday scenarios. I think that the nation watched with bated breath when the Supreme Court took this up with Gratz and Grutter in 2003, and also with both of the Fishers in 2013 and 2016, and expected that perhaps it would be the worst. Perhaps it would be the end of race-conscious admissions as we know it, and that's not what we saw. I think that people should bear in mind that the lower court decisions in both of these cases were thorough and well-reasoned. I think both of these lower court decisions are, in the neighborhood of 100 pages of factual findings that were very meticulously sorted through and considered. So having all of that in place, I'm not sure that, this is the end of race-conscious admissions as we know it. And certainly, as I said, we have a situation here where the Supreme Court has said again and again and again and again and again, it is legally permissible to consider race as one of many factors in college admissions. And it would be a sweeping reversal for them to depart from that 43 years of Supreme Court precedent.
I hear you, Michelle, but 3 of the dissenting justices that were on the Fisher case are still on the court. Several of the justices that voted to uphold the precedent of using race as a factor are gone from the court. We now have these 3 additional conservative justices, and we have this 6-3 conservative majority. Does that concern you at all? Clarence Thomas, for instance, was one of those dissenting justices in the Fisher case, and he's now senior in his stature on this court.
Sure, I'm concerned. I mean, an adverse ruling would be catastrophic for many reasons, right? We know that at Harvard, college itself, we're talking about a 50% decline over the course of 4 years in the numbers of students who are Black, Latino, Native American, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. We know, looking at the California case, that when
the 50% decrease has happened, you're saying, or that's what's likely to happen?
No. If the plaintiffs are granted the relief that they seek, the experts both agreed that they expect that the number of Black, Latino, Native American, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students would plummet to about 50% of the previous number within 4 years. So that's about 1,000 students.
Did the expert opine on what would happen with respect to Asian students if the plaintiff is successful?
Sure. So there would be a slight increase in the number of Asian American students admitted. So I want to say about 3%, while there would be a comparatively greater increase by about 8% in the number of white students admitted.
So white students would go up by 8%, Asians by 3%, African Americans, Latinx, other minorities would decrease by 50%.
That's right. And it's interesting because, you know, the plaintiff has asked for this relief. Hey, these are allegations. We're asking for this relief to remedy the intentional racial discrimination that we're alleging. That's typically not the remedy that you might see in such a case. But in one of their filings, they admitted in a footnote that they concede that they know that the admission of Black and Latino students does not account for the intentional racial discrimination that they're alleging against Asian American students. Essentially, what we have here is a situation where there's not enough Black and Latino applicants to Harvard to account for the numbers of Asian American students they allege are missing from Harvard College as a result of discrimination.
That's a little complicated. Let me follow that. You're saying there are not enough Black and Latino students that are applying to Harvard that are equal to the number of Asian students that are being denied?
That is what they've conceded. Interestingly, a study came out just a few years ago that said that the numbers of Black and Latino students who are applying to Harvard are so small that if you removed every single one of them from the applicant pool, it would maybe increase the chances that a white student or an Asian American student could get in by maybe 1%.
Okay.
So, you know, the plaintiff here
but if what you said is true, and what the expert said is true, if the plaintiff wins, Harvard would see an 8% increase in white students. That would be a significant increase for this plaintiff group.
Right. If I'm not mistaken, that's about 130 white students per a school, an admissions year.
And we'd see a dramatic decline in Black students.
Right.
Latinx students. And that's what this plaintiff wants to see, right? Campuses that are more white and less Black and brown.
You know, I'm not exactly sure what they want to see, but that would be the result. And we know from the California experience that is catastrophic. It took the University of California schools, you know, generations to try, you know, to get back to some semblance of what the numbers of Black and Latino students had been in those schools. When Proposition 209 was passed in 1996, outlawing affirmative action in California, the numbers of Black and Latino students who were getting into UC Berkeley, for example, dropped between, I want to say, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 53 and 65% respectively. And, you know, the experience of being a Black and Latino student in those schools, you know, it's traumatic when you're dealing with that level of racial isolation. And it's not safe. I mean, we've all seen the news about Black students who are being accosted in their study halls and being, you know, accused of not being in the right place. People are calling the police on them. It's, you know, there are so many harms that can come out of an adverse ruling here, unfortunately. And, you know, we know that in 2015, less Black students were attending highly selective universities than was the case in 1980. That's not good for our country, period.
Yeah. I'll give you the last word, John. What is your organization going to do leading up to this big ruling by the Supreme Court? And what do you do to continue to fight discrimination?
Well, first, similar to Michelle's group, we are going to be filing an amicus brief involved in everything we do there. And to continue to educate the community about both where Asian Americans stand, which is that we believe in the use of race, we believe in the use of affirmative action in admissions, as well as to explain to some of those within our own community who disagree with that as to why the use of race, the use of affirmative action is good for all of us. Because that's the other thing. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. Maybe the last thing I would emphasize about all of this is also understanding what the admission system is, right? Because the reality is the number of students applying to Harvard that have perfect GPAs far outnumbers by about 4 times the number of slots they have available. Even the number of students that have perfect math scores or perfect verbal SAT scores, if they continue to use those, outnumber the number of slots that they have. So I can understand, again, why a parent would say, hey, my kid didn't get in. They're so great. But the reality is there's a lot of great kids out there. And how do we build a class that is really reflective of who we are as Americans?
Yeah, great point. Yes. And a plug for other colleges. Parents, your kid can be brilliant and not go to Harvard. Although Harvard should have a diverse campus, as an alumni of Harvard, I'm glad to see they are fighting on the right side of this, but there are lots of other colleges out there, but this is a fight well worth fighting. Thanks to both the NAACP Defense Fund and to your organization, John, for the work that you are doing to fight this fight. Definitely needed. We'll be watching this case very closely. Hope to have you both back.
Thank you.
All right. Now, my next guest is Professor Margalynne Armstrong. She's a professor of law at Santa Clara Law School. So we're talking about the law and affirmative action and wanted to get her to weigh in on this. Good morning, Professor Armstrong.
Thank you for having me, Areva. Good morning.
Good morning. So you're listening to this conversation. You know this case is headed to the Supreme Court. Let's clear up a couple of things, though, before we talk about what's likely to happen in this case. When Biden confirmed that he was going to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court, this affirmative action was prominent in the media because Republicans started screaming and yelling that the nominee was going to be an affirmative action candidate. So help us understand why that is just ridiculous on so many different levels and where affirmative action is with respect to employment versus university admissions.
Well, first of all, it's a political argument. It's using affirmative action as a wedge issue. And it's really appealing to the voters in the areas where these representatives are from. You know, for example, Ted Cruz in Texas. So he's arguing to his base. In terms of the argument that this is affirmative action is really just a way of looking beyond the test.
Oh, I think we lost your sound, Professor Armstrong.
Sorry. So affirmative action is something that is argued against because it goes beyond the tools such as the SAT or the LSAT for law and scores, GPAs, that make admissions decisions easier. These things were instituted as being important when the number of people who were applying for schools rose and the individual consideration of applications became more difficult. So these numbers are used as screening devices, particularly with the LSAT or the SAT. These were instruments that we know are really reflective more of your class background, your economic upbringing, and they also have negative effects on minorities because they were kind of culturally biased. So
but before we talk about the admissions, I wanted you to hone in on the comments that they're making about the Supreme Court nominee.
Okay.
Because that is why we're talking about affirmative action. Obviously, it's the court case involving the admissions, but it's also how Republicans are trying to taint the Black woman that's going to the Supreme Court, suggesting that she is an affirmative action nominee and ultimately will be an affirmative action justice. And obviously they mean that in a pejorative or negative manner.
Well, as I said, it's political. It's appealing to their base, and it's also appealing to the kind of tensions within the white community and Asian community to some extent who feel disadvantaged because the system is not something that they feel helps them particularly. So to say affirmative action is to not look at the qualifications of the candidate and to just use these words that trigger people's anger.
But affirmative action, help us understand the status of affirmative action outside of college admissions. What's the status? Can employers even use race as a factor in making employment decisions?
Well, to the extent that it's a tiebreaker, surely they can do that. So, and you have people of similar qualifications, backgrounds, and you decide that it's important to have a diverse workforce, you can certainly do that. And, the person who loses the job is facing somebody who's equally qualified as they are. And so they're going to, again, blame affirmative action. But in terms of recognizing the importance of having a workforce that is representative, that is able to deal with the broad spectrum of people who are the clients or customers of corporations, there's clearly a need on the part of the employers to have a workforce that can really reach all segments of the community.
I want to bring into the conversation Jared Bass. He's a senior director, higher education at the Center for American Progress. Good morning, Jared.
Morning.
We often, again, hear affirmative action used, it's politicized, it's weaponized against Black folks to somehow suggest that we're not as qualified. Can you correct the record in terms of how affirmative action in many instances benefit white women more than it has benefited African Americans?
Yeah, so I think in the history of affirmative action in the higher education context, we actually have seen like a growth of white women actually increase in enrollment for white women over that period of time as well. So there is evidence to suggest that like white women in particular have benefited from the practice of affirmative action, which is all just about being able to tell your story in the context of race as like one factor. So I think some of the previous guests talked about this, is that it's not that a university or institution is looking at you and saying, hey, you're Black, you're Asian, welcome to our university. There's still an admissions process that looks at, the whole of the person. And so if we eliminate affirmative action in this context, you're taking away that ability for people to, tell their story, show the whole of who they are. But yes, to answer your question, there have been some benefits associated with affirmative action and white women in particular.
Areva, let me just say that most recently, the beneficiaries of affirmative action in college admissions have been white males, because their pool, the pool of white male applicants to college, has decreased, and colleges are very interested in having at least a 50-50 base with respect to males and females in their classes. And so for the past few years, white males have had an advantage in terms of being admitted with lower, quote unquote, credentials than women and minorities.
That's very interesting. What is causing there to be a shortage of white men applying to colleges? Do we know?
Well, go ahead.
Please go ahead, Professor Armstrong.
Well, one of the issues is money, and the question of whether or not college education is actually that much more beneficial for white males, because they have an advantage over even college educated minorities by having a high school diploma. So part of it is just a decision in terms of the value of college for them.
So they're doing a cost benefit analysis saying, as a white male with a high school diploma, I can do as well, if not better, than a minority candidate that has a college degree and has gone into debt for $60,000, $70,000, $100,000. It's just not worth it for them to go to that kind of college debt.
Yeah, he can go for a job and not incur that debt and be successful.
Wow. Go ahead, Jared. You wanted to weigh in on that?
So I agree with that. So I think, one is this conversation that we're having around higher education and attacks on higher education itself. I think we saw that in the last administration, attacking, elite colleges, endowments, and that sort of thing. So I think that there's this question of the value of higher education, especially within, white communities, of saying, well, do I need to go to college? Can I just, take up a trade or do these other things that, have been shown to be more favorable for white Americans? And there is discrimination that the Biden administration is trying to address, and things like apprenticeships and, workforce development context. But yeah, truly there is discrimination that I think benefits, white Americans within that context. And that's something that, the administration is trying to address. And also, it's across the board. So, minorities or underrepresented minorities, don't share the same benefits of their degree with their white counterparts. So at the BA level, at the master's degree level, they're not, they don't, receive the same benefits as far as like pay, as far as, opportunities. And so some people say that, you have to get a master's degree just to compete with someone who has a BA degree, if you're a person of color. And so we do see that just within the context of not only, high school, but also, credentials beyond high school as well.
So, Professor Armstrong, what will happen if the Supreme Court reverses almost 40 years of precedent and determines that colleges cannot use race in admissions? What's going to happen to those colleges that are trying to recruit these white men? Will they be able to continue to do that?
Oh, of course, because it's not considered to be discriminatory in terms of the idea of having a balanced class in terms of gender. It technically is, but it doesn't bother people when you say, well, we want to have 50-50 at least, because the student body is going to be, if it's predominantly female, it's actually been shown to discourage men from wanting to apply. And so the universities are going to figure out some way to balance their classes. One thing that may happen if affirmative action is eliminated is that use of these standardized tests will be eliminated. The University of California system is eliminating requirements that applicants take these standardized tests. And what that means is there will be a more holistic review of students, but there's still the issues of GPAs and things like advanced placement courses that often benefit communities that have more resources and more alternatives for the students. So on the one hand, you may see the elimination of standardized tests as a response, but in the end, I think there'll be two things. One, it's probably just going to discourage people of color from applying to schools because, like in the University of California, the applications went down so drastically after 2009. It took years for the University of California to convince Black and Latino students that they were welcome and that they were wanted at these schools. So there's going to be effects on the admissions process, but there's also going to be effects in terms of students of color being discouraged from applying to school or higher education, because it's such a symbol of not being valued.
Right.
Can I also add to that, just about the impact? So, I think this was brought up in the earlier conversation, but I think really looking to states where they have banned affirmative action would probably be a good indicator. So I think there are about 9 states right now that actually ban consideration of race, affirmative action in the United States. And so at least in some of the studies that we've seen concentrating on California, and, they've shown, and I think this issue was brought up in the conversation as well, it's really about selectivity. So, representation and, highly selective universities is going to go down. Because race won't be one of many factors that's considered. Degree attainment may also go down, and what we'll see is other policies creep up, right, that like may serve as proxies, but those don't do justice. So things like socioeconomic status and focusing on that, but that's not a good proxy for race because, again, similarly situated Black and white people are going to have different experiences as far as where they live. You know, we talk about the racial wealth gap. And so, you know, we'll see universities try to get around the issue if they can't use race, but it won't be a good indicator. You know, we've seen this time and time again with states that have started to use the, you know, top 10, top 20% programs of graduating the top 10 and 20%, allowing them to get into a public university. But again, it doesn't really address the issue of selectivity because it may just be a public university instead of being the flagship or the elite university within, you know, that state. So there really is a risk of, you know, harm here as far as representation in highly selective institutions if race is not a factor. And last point is that affirmative action, I think race conscious admissions aren't as prevalent as everyone thinks. You know, we alluded to this in the earlier conversation. I think one estimate is between 2 to 13%, depending on if it's, you know, a considerable, you know, factor or a moderate factor for institutions. So it's not like every institution in the United States is using race as a, you know, factor in their admissions. And, you know, race matters. I mean, we're seeing that right now. It matters in the context of like HBCUs and bomb threats, right? It matters in, you know, the context of, you know, higher education admissions as well. So just wanted to make that point that, you know, we do see racially motivated violence. We see racially motivated bomb threats. And so I think it's also fair to just say we should have race as a factor in the admissions process and allow people to tell their own story.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Professor Armstrong, this concept of race being a factor that should be considered because it allows people to, as you said, Jared, tell their own story. Justice Roberts wrote in a 2006 voting rights case, making reference to race, he says it's a sordid business, this divvying us up by race. He went on to say then, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discrimination on the basis of race. Is that the kind of sentiment that this court is going to bring to the decision-making process with respect to this case on affirmative action in college admissions? This notion that the way we stop discriminating is by stop using race, this whole notion of there being somehow this colorblind society and we should all just wipe race out of our minds. We shouldn't talk about it. We shouldn't think about it. Think about everybody as equal. Is that the kind of naive approach that we should expect this court to take? Because that's Justice Roberts, and he's one that we need because he could be a potential swing vote. He sometimes votes with the more liberal justices on the court.
Well, it's interesting because I think there's a division among the three justices that were appointed in the Trump administration. So I would suspect that Gorsuch would go along the same lines as Roberts did. With respect to Amy Coney Barrett, that's really interesting. You know, she does have a family that's mixed race. And so I'm not sure what her perspective is as being somebody who, you know, has to deal with a world that might treat her children differently on the basis of race. But, you know, from a consistent perspective with her general jurisprudence, I would say that she would probably be along the Roberts line. And then with respect to Kavanaugh, he's also kind of interesting in terms of his racial understandings, because he's one of the few judges before he was appointed to the Supreme Court who had diversity among his law clerks. So he seemed to think that was an important thing. So I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a monolithic decision, but you had brought up earlier, like, why are they taking this case when just a few years ago they decided the Fisher case?
Right.
Well, it's because Kennedy is gone. It's because this court has been very willing to take cases that were recently decided. So the whole issue with respect to abortion, they took a case that has such similar facts to a Whole Woman's Health that was decided just 2 years ago. And from the oral argument, it seems as if they're ready to go ahead and reverse even possibly Roe versus Wade, but certainly what they decided in Whole Woman's Health. So we have a court that is, I don't know how to say anything other than it's making political choices about what cases to take and making political choices about whether it will apply precedent or not.
That's very dangerous and very scary for us. And even though this Black woman is likely to be nominated by hopefully the end of the month and confirmed shortly thereafter, what hopes do you have for how her decision-making, her voice on this court can impact a case like this? I'll ask you first, Jared, and I'll give you the last word, Professor Armstrong. Are you hopeful that a Black woman brings a new voice to this court, particularly on this case? We know there's a still 6-3 conservative majority, not likely to be able to change that, but what are you hoping that this new justice brings?
So I think representation matters, and I think the perspective matters. And so I think having, a very qualified, Black African-American woman on the court, brings that perspective, and hopefully will translate decisions. So, I think several things come to mind here. First is I'm hopeful that, I think someone alluded to this earlier. I think it was Michelle who said that, it may be that they don't overturn, precedent completely. There may just be a narrowing. We've seen in the jurisprudence of the history of affirmative action that it just keeps getting narrower and narrower, the focus and how you can use it. I also think that, justices do have a voice. And so a strong dissent, if it is overturned, could lay the foundation for future consideration, I think, of a less political court. And so even just having that opinion, that context, will still resonate. And I think, will be a strong indication about like race and could be used to set up, I think, future, legal precedents if, we do see Scrutter and the affirmative action jurisprudence overturned. But I think just having a voice in the conversation, adding that perspective is going to be very, very helpful in the consideration. And the other thing I'll say is that, it also could just be interesting to see how this shakes out. We saw in Bakke, right? It was 4-1-4, and then we saw a deciding justice joining and creating a majority and a plurality decision on some parts, saying that hey, racial quota systems are not okay, but then also joining another side of the court and saying hey, you can use race to help with diversity. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out, even on this court. And I think having the perspective of a Black justice, a Black female justice, will be helpful in just shaping the conversation and rounding it out.
What about you, Professor Armstrong? What are you hoping that a Black woman on the Supreme Court brings to this decision in particular?
Well, there's the possibility of persuasion. Justice O'Connor was able to influence Justice Kennedy in several cases, in cases that looked like, again, this is about abortion, but looked like it was going to end Roe versus Wade. And Justice Kennedy changed his mind based on the conversations that he had with Justice O'Connor. So there is deliberation among the justices. And, I'm not convinced that there'll be changes in this particular issue, but it will add to the discussion. Mm-hmm. And again, just bringing in the voice, a voice that's never been on the Supreme Court before, in terms of the intersectional perspective that you have when you have a Black woman. And so, again, it might not be an immediate effect, but maybe this is one of these instances where the arc of justice is going to be long. That's why it's important to appoint someone young, so that they're on the court for as long as possible, which is too bad for me. But anyway.
No, excellent point. Arc of justice is long. We got to be patient. May not get it all in this first term with respect to this case, but there are going to be many, many more challenges, particularly given the activism that we see on this court. So we're going to be watching, obviously, this case very closely. Thank you so much, Jared. Thank you, Professor Armstrong. Always great to have your insights. One that we will all be following very closely because it could have grave impacts and ramifications on college admissions, and particularly as it relates to students of color. Whew, this is going to be one for us. All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
I want to thank all my guests this morning, and thank you for joining. This is such a complicated subject because affirmative action is used as a political weapon, as Professor Armstrong said, is used to somehow denigrate Black people, to suggest that Black people who are in positions of power got there simply because of their race rather than their credentials. And we see it being used against these women who are on this short list for the U.S. Supreme Court, women who have some of the highest degrees and best credentials you could imagine for someone being even considered for the court. Law professors, federal court judges, civil rights leaders, degrees from Harvard, Yale, Stanford. They've done everything that society tells them to do. They can check every box that they have been asked to check. They've overcome obstacle after obstacle, which is what you have to do to become a Black woman attorney in this country. It's what you have to do to become a Black woman judge in this country. You've already had to demonstrate such resilience, such power, such perseverance, because there are so many obstacles placed in your pathway. So no doubt these women will be qualified. I just wanted to have this conversation because I wanted people to have a better understanding about the race, the issue of race, particularly as it relates to college admissions, and also how people other than Blacks and Latinos benefit from affirmative action. I think we have to say it over and over again. White women benefit from affirmative action, whether it's in college admissions or in employment or in contracting. We've seen it over and over again, white women benefiting. And as Professor Armstrong just told us, white male college students are benefiting from these policies as universities are using race, using their whiteness to admit them into colleges under the guise of wanting to have this balanced campus of equal numbers of men and women. So when universities, when institutions want to select folks, white folks or Black folks or Asian folks, they have ways of doing it. And I so thank John for sharing with us that the Asian community overall overwhelmingly supports affirmative action in college admissions, and that they are not opposed to these policies. And even though, as he said, there's some anti-Blackness that exists in some Asian communities, there is solidarity on the issue of affirmative action. So lots for all of us to think about, and anyone that has a student that's headed to college or is in college or been to college, these are issues you should know about and care about, because these impact our future leaders. Folks who are graduating from these colleges go on to be our congresspeople, our senators. They go on to the White House. They go on to lead corporations and to lead institutions around this country. So some words to live by before I get out. No doubt all children deserve an equal and high quality education. Now, that doesn't mean every child deserves to go to Harvard or even needs to go to Harvard, because look at all the successful people in this world that never step foot on a campus like Harvard, Yale, or Stanford. So I'm not a proponent of everybody has to go to an elite college, but everybody is entitled to a high quality education wherever that is. And the reality is our society right now, the way it's set up, our institutions, that's not guaranteed. In fact, the opposite is. Students of color are grossly underrepresented, as we know, in selective colleges, and earning a degree, as we also know, can change the entire trajectory of someone's life financially and their future generations. It's a travesty to live in this country where marginalized groups have had to fight this hard just to get a foot in the door. With affirmative action, it's not only the solution, it's not the only solution in eradicating the inequities that exist in our educational system. No, it's not the only solution. But no doubt, make no mistakes, it is and remains a vital tool in eliminating those inequities. My hope and my prayer is that the Supreme Court has an epiphany and realizes this too. Short of that, we can kiss diversity at elite colleges goodbye forever. That would be such a shame. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Wear your mask. Remember, we're all in this together.